culture is obviously fragmenting today. We've seen many concerns from parents and others, especially Christian parents now, who see the society that they grew up in slipping away. Nowhere is this more transparent than in the tensions that are showing up in households all over the country. What does it mean that this new identity politics, these new identity concepts that are being introduced to our children and to our nation are starting to pull apart the very building block of society, that is the family? Well, these questions and more we're going to be answering on this Come Let Us Reason Together. Hi, everyone. This is Lenny Esposito bringing you another Come Let Us Reason podcast, and I'm very excited today to tackle a topic that I find just incredibly important as well as interesting. It's the war on the household, how our culture and our of self and identity is really starting to undermine the very thing that is the basis for our society, and that is the family unit. And I am excited today to bring to you a very good friend of mine, someone that you'll know already if you've been watching the podcasts in the past. This is Dr. Jacob Daniel from Heritage Council. Jacob and I known each other for quite some time. We're friends. We appear on the apologetics.com radio show together every month. And Jacob, welcome. I'm so glad to see that you're here. And, tell me a little bit more about yourself and about Heritage Council.
Hey, Lenny, it's so good to be here on the show. Thank you for the honor. Yeah, and as you mentioned that it's been an honor to be on the radio for, I don't know how many years, and maybe about 8 or 9 years together. So yeah, it's good to be on the show. Heritage Council is a missions project with Missionary Gospel Fellowship, and basically the vision is to advance the transforming truth of Christian faith and promote its excellence in public life. So the idea is basically to help balance what we are preaching and advocating and to actualize that in our culture through the means of cultural exegesis.
Oh, that's great. And what's interesting is, of course, you are not necessarily native to the United States, so you bring a really clear perspective on how things are changing, how they have changed, what this looks like compared to, say, an international audience. You're native of India, although your family has Christian roots going all the way back several generations, if I remember right, which is fascinating in and of itself because that's a very small minority. But so how did you, tell me how that's hitting you now?
It goes against the Western narrative that Christianity is basically Western. If I talk to my parents, they would connect all the way their lineage to St. Thomas, who landed on the shores of India 2,000 years ago. So in one sense, it's kind of indigenous to India as well. Having said that, we are still minority there. And all my life growing between the cultures, I had to also defend the faith that I had. So that's the interest I had in apologetics. But God, in his providence, had a different, way of or different plan for our life and ministry. He exposed us to different cultures. And that's what took us to different countries around the world, and we lived and for work and for study, and then eventually moved here to the West. So we are missionaries. My wife and I, we are missionaries here to the West. The focus is to help the church be equipped with what is needed in terms of cultural exegesis, knowing where we are as a culture and how can we present the gospel as relevant and necessary for a flourishing life. So that's the goal. And I'm grateful for the opportunities that we've been getting. And if I may say this now, what I'm seeing is that the West is facing two kinds of threats. One is existential threat that we can talk about maybe in some other show. But there is an ideological threat. So the way I see as an Easterner where West is heading is that the West has become Hindu in many ways. And we can talk more about it. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, well, that's intriguing in and of its own right. But let's start with the idea that, and let's try to support the premise that the family today is endangered by modern understandings of self and identity. Of course, it's important, I think, for people to understand that really the family is the building block of all society. It's the basic unit. It's not an individual. And some people make this mistake, especially in the United States, where we, have grown up to be such an individualistic culture. But individuals can only go so far by themselves. They need others. And they need, if they're ever hoping to replicate the values and the systems that they're creating, well, they need to have another generation come along underneath them, right?
Yes.
That's what it says in the preamble to the Constitution, to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity.
Exactly.
So
I would say, to emphasize a point in this, and you're absolutely right, Lenny. Family is the primary unit, but of authority. That's where we need to understand. When God established family, he established a structure of authority. That's why in our culture today, we see so much of attack against the household. There's a overt, attempt to actually divide the household, and kind of like too much of emphasis on the fact that individuals alone matter. But at the same time, there's the other side of it as well. The whole idea of which we can talk about in a while is the emphasis on the collective. So whereby we not only lose the individual, but also the individualism together. So with regards to family, this is what I would say. This is where we need to start as parents and people who are really understanding what the role of household is in creating a flourishing society, is that we are reminded in Colossians chapter 2 that, and let me read this, beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that we've been deceived by is that we have bought into this idea that we are not influenced by any philosophy. And I time and again do hear this from the pulpit as well, that there is some sort of neutrality that exists in our collective existence. Nothing can be far from truth, I believe. It's not whether we are influenced by philosophy, but which philosophy are we influenced by? And in Colossians, Paul is very clear that he's saying that there are only two kinds of philosophy, which one is according to the tradition of men,
right,
and the other that submits to Christ's lordship. And we need to understand that our children, and including us as well, we are being regularly catechized by either of the philosophies. As much as the church is interested in discipling our children and us, the world is equally interested in discipling us. And this is why we need to be knowing what is the basic philosophy of our time that is cheating our children of their true identity and their righteous identity in Christ.
So you had said that there's an overt move to try to undermine the family structure. What do you mean by that? Why don't we tease that out a little bit and tell me what you think?
So we need to understand that we as a society are a product of ideas as well. Ideas do have consequences, not only in terms of individuals, but also in terms of society in which we live. We are, as you emphasize so well, that we are created to be social beings. We are created to be together. And the thing that unites us together is, or glues us together, is a common sense of ideas that we subscribe to. And in our culture today, what we are seeing is the emergence of the philosophy of the self, also called existentialism, which was made popular by Jean-Paul Sartre, and it has taken roots within the Western psyche now. Earlier times, there is, as an Easterner, I can say that there is no confusion in my mind when I landed here in the West that the Western world is primarily informed by Judeo-Christian worldview, right? Ideas that it promoted in creating one of the most flourishing societies in the world, at least in the modern world, right? So ideas do have consequences. So right now, what we are seeing, as I said, is that this idea of the philosophy of self is trying to actually bend the arc of history. And why it is so important for us to be engaging with these ideas, because this is not just a philosophy used to analyze the world, but it is also being used to change it, right?
Yeah.
And that's an important idea. So it's not merely a philosophy to engage at the abstract realm. It is a philosophy that is seeping down into our culture and defining our public behavior.
So let's get an example. I think that'll be helpful. In January 1st, a new law went into effect in the state of California that said, and it was a response to Texas specifically, but some other states that were trying to prevent or protect children from rashly becoming subjects of medical procedures because they felt as if they were a boy in a girl's body or something like that. Those kids who at 12 or 15 claim to be transgender. Now, all the studies we've seen, we know that what usually happens is that young adolescents, by the time they hit 20 to 24, by the time their puberty has completed, they've resolved and usually are satisfied with the body with which they're born. They identify as their birth sex. That's for the vast majority of cases. If they're left alone. If they're not, if they undergo hormone replacement therapy, there tends to be a delay in that. That confusion actually extends. So Texas and some of these states have put specific safeguards in, saying that it's the parents who need to make these decisions, and the parents can say no. California passed a law that says that if you are a transgender or a person desiring to begin transitioning your gender, you can come to the state of California and we can have the state sit as in loco parentis. Basically, without the parent, the state can take the responsibility of not merely just approving you because the parents aren't there, but actually contradicting the choice of the parent. That's and that's scary, where the state says, no, parent, you don't know what's best for your own child. I'm going to tell you what's best for your own child. That's a primary example of what we're talking about here.
True. And I think we need to understand that there are some basic assumptions that go behind these policies, right? It's not random in any sense. And that's what the church needs to understand. Many times we think that it's merely with the way of the flow things come about. No. That's why initially I was saying that it's in many ways an overt, attempt to dismantle the household for an ulterior purpose, and which we can talk about. So let's go a step behind and see why this is happening. So what's happening right now, philosophically at least, and people may not be articulating it this way, behind all these ideas, there is a philosophy where people have bought into this idea, at least our children. They've been taught this, that the ultimate reality is one. They have bought into this idea of oneism, the idea that man and nature ultimately share the same essence with the divine, though they may not.
It's very Gnostic, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. Against the biblical idea, which is twoism. Peter Jones talks about that, which maintains a necessary distinction between the creator and the creation. Right? And so in adopting this, as Romans 1 reminds us in verse 25, that we have exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature instead of the creator, right? So what we are seeing is an alliance of the will of man with that of Satan and its manifestation that comes about in policies such as this. We are doing that we've been doing for a long time. We are flirting with the age-old idea of becoming like God.
Yeah.
And there's an Hindu idea of aham brahmasmi, that I am Brahma.
All Brahman is Atman.
We have the same essence like the ultimate reality. If that is the case, so let's think through this very idea of gender dysphoria and all, why that is happening. So once you buy into this idea that one's divinity is the essence of one's divinity is same as the ultimate reality, then you have to remove all distinctions. You have to attack the binaries. If ultimate reality is one, you can't talk about gender binaries, male and female. It has to be fluid. You can't talk about physical binaries. the whole idea of fatism that you can't argue for. Just today, I read that there is an argument to ban the word fitness because it is ableist,
Oh
right?
my.
What about logical binaries? You can't then
Right.
argue about truth and false. So what's happening is right now is that because we have bought into this idea, at least subconsciously, we are hating any kind of constraints,
Yeah.
right? So being created basically imposes on us severe limits. But our kids have been taught that the American idea is that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that we all are created equal,
Right.
right? So we have even thrown away that idea of being created equal,
Yeah.
and because we know that when we are created, there are certain severe limits that are or constraints that are put around us. So, and family is, as I mentioned, that basic unit that imposes those constraints around their children. So what the state does is that it wants to replace the family as the authoritative unit and consider itself to be that, right? And in so doing, they are the one dictating as to what the gender should be or what one's identity should be. And you'll be surprised to know that recently in school districts, with the new curriculum with CRT and everything that I've been engaging with, one of the terms had been very common. So they would never call the parents parents. The term that they were using was caretakers.
Huh.
So parents
So
are merely
they're
caretakers.
adopting the phrase caretaker in school sessions to be genericized idea of it's like spouse instead of husband or wife. But a
Exactly.
caretaker is one step removed from that because a caretaker isn't necessarily the person he has the legal right or
Yeah.
has any biological linkage to
Yeah.
the individual.
Yeah. And continuing on the theme that I was talking about, that the West is becoming Hindu, then we have bought into certain whispers of devil, as Carl Tekrib talks about, certain mantras that are very prevalent in our society. One of which is that I'm spiritual, not religious,
Yeah,
right?
I
Just like the whole idea of gender, that you want to remove all constraints and parameters, you want to remove parameters from spirituality. That's what religion is,
right.
right? Religion is spirituality with parameters.
I've always found that to be there's a lot of play in language today to make things sound palatable, but when you actually start to dig underneath it, you find out that there's nothing there. So I am spiritual but not religious is one of those concepts. What does that mean if your spirituality isn't attached to any specific beliefs? How can you be?
Yes.
How can you be spirit? If you're spiritual, that means you have to hold to some kind of a spiritual entity. Either yourself is the ultimate spiritual entity, or something, right? So if you don't define that, and as soon as you define what that entity is, now you're talking religion.
Yes.
It really it's a vagary meant to wiggle out of, I guess, compulsion or wiggle out of responsibility, I should say, in order
Yeah.
to not have to be judged by it.
And this is why, from a Christian perspective, we understand this, that today revelation is being replaced by lived
Yeah.
experiences, because the focus is no more on God or the
Oh,
ultimate.
any objective
object-
idea. Yeah.
Exactly. God's revelation gets replaced by self-revelation. Ethically speaking, as Carl Truman talks about this,
Yeah.
you might have read in his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self,
That's
that
right.
taste becomes truth.
Yes, and
Truth
and
becomes a
and,
function
and
of
as
feeling.
we're going through
Yeah.
that book together, which has really been a lot of fun. But
Yes.
it's what's fascinating to me about this, and I don't know that Truman talks about it, but one of the things I think has happened in our society is that people who would have otherwise understood certain objective standards have pulled those into doubt. So they're doubtful of certain ideas of objectivity based on the fact that, well, things can be faked, right? How can I know for sure because I don't have 100% certainty, therefore I can't know a thing. So there's a
Yeah.
misunderstanding of epistemology, misunderstanding of what it means to know something, that you have to have certainty for it. But
Yeah.
beyond that, what happens is I can have 100% certainty that I feel X. I mean, I might not even be understanding what I see in front of me, because it could be right. We all know how to fake the videos or deep fakes on all that stuff. But I know what I
Yeah.
feel, and nobody can tell me I don't feel what I feel. So that becomes the ultimate
This, yeah,
idea.
yeah, exactly. And this is why there's so much of emphasis on the second mantra of our age: be
Be
authentic.
authentic.
Basically, the idea is, Descartes' axiom that, I think, therefore I am. So I become the center of defining as to what certainty is. And that's what's happening in our culture. So looking inward uh, becomes the priority. But the time in which we are living, it's interesting that looking inward is not sufficient anymore. It has to be expressed outside. And not only that, it has to get affirmed by others, even if
That's
it means
huge.
forcefully,
That's
right?
that's
So
huge.
so I call it realized individualism. So basically the idea is that I'm sufficient within to know who I am, create my own identity, and express it outside and get it affirmed by
Yeah.
others.
And now
So yes,
let's talk about that. I'm sorry.
um,
But I want to catch this point, because one of the roles of a parent is to not simply affirm you, right? There is, if you affirm everything a child does, if you agree with everything a child desires, that's a recipe for spoiling a child. That's exactly,
yes,
if you want to spoil a child, just give him what he wants, tell him everything that he's done is fine. The
and this
role
is
of,
exactly what we did. This is
yeah,
exactly what we did for decades. We've been telling them that they are enough. They can become whatever they
whatever,
want to
right.
be, right?
But
Yeah.
parents, so the role of parents are to help guide and shape the child, and that usually requires work. It requires discipline, right? It requires,
Yes.
and again, I was talking with some other folks about the idea of discipline in the scriptures, and how that, people seem to think that that's a negative connotation, because they tie the idea of discipline with punishment. Discipline isn't punishment. The root word of discipline is disciple. It's training
It's
into,
more workout.
yeah, it's training into a virtuous human being. That's what you do when you disciple someone. You're training. If you're discipling, if you're a coach and you're discipling a ball player on how to hit, you train them to swing the bat in a certain way. You train them to put your elbow up here and keep this one down, and right, or a golf swing,
Yes.
which is naturally very awkward. You train them to do what is initially awkward, so it becomes easily done, and it's done naturally and fluidly. That's what parents are to do. But here's the thing: in a culture of affirmation, that's not affirming. You're telling them all their
Exactly.
mistakes, and it rubs people the
Yes.
wrong way. So it's interesting that affirmation is what you look for outside of the family. And when those outside of the family believe that their job is to only affirm you because we wouldn't want you to feel bad, those bad feelings are real. And if that's the only status, if that's the only bar against which you're trying to cross, then of course it's going to drive a wedge in the family, because the affirming people are those the people out there, and the people who make you
Yeah.
work are these people here at the home, and that becomes a huge problem.
And I think we have a biblical example and precedence for something I want to really highlight
Okay.
to our listeners. So if we look at Christ and what he did, we see that he sympathizes with us in our sin. He never empathizes us by becoming one, or by sinning.
By sinning.
There's a huge difference there,
Yeah.
right? He becomes sin on the cross for us, but he doesn't sin by empathizing with us, right? So that basic distinction has to be maintained between sympathy and empathy.
So the woman caught
So
in an act of adultery, as an example.
exactly. And in our culture, what's happening is that there's a confusion between the two. So when our children are asking us to affirm them, what they're asking us to do is empathize with them. They want us to get into their shoes and acknowledge and celebrate and affirm their orientations or their preferences. Whereas as Christians, we need to be discerning of what we should be empathizing with and what we should be sympathizing with.
Right.
And that distinction has to be maintained. As parents, we all understand that we all are sinners. We all have shortcomings. We have done mistakes. And we can always sympathize with others on that. But when it comes to those matters that cause us to sin, we should never be empathizing. But sadly, this is the case. We live in a culture, including our social media. It capitalizes on that culture of affirmation,
Right.
right? That's how they can make money. That's how the more clicks you get, the more affirmed you
Right.
get.
Right.
And so that's where we, as parents, we need to build that kind of culture even within the household, where you maintain that distinction in a way that is accepted by your children as well.
Now, let's talk a little bit about social media and its influence and why I mean, we've heard in the past, especially if you've grown up in the era of television, how media can be a corruptive influence. And there's some truth to that. But why do we feel that this kind of the social media boom, isn't it just another form of media? And is it the same kind of Chicken Little, the sky is falling reaction? I don't think so. And here's why. Here's one of the things that I'm gonna say. In the past, so let's just take something like body image. So what you were talking about before, fat shaming and body acceptance, things like that. There have been in the past many people who've said, yes, Hollywood has this portrayal of a stereotype, an unreachable level of perfection. You have these, supermodels and people that are, even the girls who are selling beer in the commercials are just these beautiful things. And they've decried these kinds of ideas that in the magazines and in the television show, that's a problem. Okay. So yeah, that's true to an extent. I don't necessarily disagree with that. But I think there's a significant number of individuals who would say, well, yeah, I'll never be Cindy Crawford, and they would say they all kind of understood in the back of their head that those are the one in a millions. Those, it's a very small handful of people who've dealt with that. In social media, though, what happens is the most popular girl in school is a girl and she portrays her life. And everyone does it in the most perfect way possible. They don't show you the unmade bed outside the frame or the disaster that's there. It's amazing when you actually talk to people where you think that their life is going so well, and because you've kept up with them on Facebook, and then you talk to them and you find out there's some real struggles in their lives, but that never makes it to the social media pages. So in this instance, now you have girls especially, but kids generally, using an unrealistic standard, but it's their friends. And so they think, well, of course I should be able to attain that because my friends are doing it and I see them every day at school. And that's one of the reasons I think that the social media issue can be so problematic. Jonathan Haidt has the man who wrote, oh gosh, what's Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukian's book? How am I blanking on that now? Anyway, Jonathan Haidt had noted that he looked at this as well, and he says, no, as a sociologist, he says, no, this is a real danger. He also had said that, we see it in the number of states of depression. We see it in the number of suicides, how suicide rates are going up. It becomes pretty serious. So it's an important issue that there is a significant amount of assumption that these kids take. And I think one of the jobs as parents is to say, hey, what you see online, that's actually less real than even what maybe modern media will portray, because people are trying to convince you that they're better than what you actually think.
Yeah, and Abigail Schreier, actually, she touches on this aspect that you're talking about, the whole idea of social contagion, right? And she talks about these young girls basically being influenced by a group to make transition in terms of their gender,
Right.
in terms of their, the whole transgenderism being adopted into that age group, particular age group. Now, there's a danger to social media in this, that we are accustomed to actually creating our own customized sacred places. And social media allows for that, the intersection of certain vulnerabilities and victimhood, right? And that's what we are seeing, a kind of caste system. So as an Easterner, when I look at this, I see that people are creating this, organizing their power against an endless stream of complaints or injustices that they actually, or unforgivable sins that they actually see. And that's danger, because what it does is that it fragments our children. It fragments the society even more based on identity groups. And the danger is that it becomes very mechanized, a kind of mechanized collectivism, right? And on the premise that the way to authority is through some sort of autonomous rebellion or something. And that's where historical way of reformation is replaced by revolution. And today, it's not mostly, we get startled by all this chaos and everything that we see on the street, but we completely ignore the fact that much of the protesting and chaos is happening on internet.
Yeah.
It's happening online, right? There is this autonomous rebellion being taking place through the means of internet, and also through the means of social media. So there are a couple of things that it does, especially with young people. They feel hostility towards the traditions,
Right.
and hostility towards traditional marriages or units or institutions that we are so used to. And they are lumped into this kind of like the idea of oppressor and oppressed that we are seeing in our culture today. And redemption is usually seen through identity groups. It becomes a new power arrangement for them. So ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, what happens is that with our young people also, they find themselves in that place where power replaces individual liberty. So they not only lose their individualism, but themselves at the end. So all that they are left to do is engage in activism through their sacred groups that they
and you're right, because what these folks aren't doing, they're not simply affirming. That's not. They're actually advocating to rebel against anyone who doesn't also affirm. And you can see this clearly in any one of the thousands of individuals who've put their stories online about when they detransition. So as I say, a lot of times these kinds of issues resolve themselves. Unfortunately, many times now, as the numbers get higher and more young people have put themselves under the knife, double mastectomies, things like that, we're now finding more and more people who are wounded after they hit 19 or 20 and saying, I didn't want to do this. But when they detransition, when they say, I know I'm not that sex, I'm this sex, all of a sudden, all that affirmation, all of that thing that's rebellion goes away. And wouldn't it be the same thing? You're still saying, I was a girl, now I'm a boy, now I'm going to be a girl again. I was a boy, now I'm, right? So it should be, if it doesn't matter which way that door should swing, but it seems to. If you transition back to your biological sex, if you say that your gender identity is now, I'm abandoning my past claims and I'm going back to my biological sex, you are shunned by that community. You are closed off. It has nothing to do with support for you as an individual. It has nothing to do with, we don't want you to commit suicide. Those are all red herrings. They're false flags. And what happens is they get closed out and they're left wounded many times for quite a long period of time, having no one to support them.
At the same time, I'm also hopeful, Lenny. Just we have to, as I wrote a few weeks ago, that we have to let bad ideas die out. It might be through the way of pain, but historically we've seen people do realize when we'll have more cases like this, there is no way you can hide it under the rug forever. And I think people are realizing it. I'm very optimistic. The events of last few years, uh, uh, I've seen that parents are realizing the importance of them not capitulating to the pressures of the culture. They're standing up, they're voicing their concerns, and not only that, they are recapturing what they had delegated, their role of discipleship to their kids, to maybe their youth pastors or to the school or other authorities, right? Not even vetting them properly as to what they were catechizing their kids
Yeah.
with. So I'm optimistic about this,
I think,
but in all,
yeah, I
yeah,
think we are seeing a bit of a tipping point. I think when you started coming after folks' kids and they're starting to see the wounds that are coming along,
yeah,
that it's really moved a lot of parents to get involved who were otherwise nonchalant about it or apathetic. I think that it's tragic that we're going to see a whole lot more wounded people before this is over. Though I wish there was something we can do to avoid that.
yeah.
I've likened transgenderism to the snake oil of the 21st century. It's just it's something that has no substance to it.
The thing is that I think people in that camp which would want to actually push these ideologies, they, in my opinion, are recognizing that this is even for them an experimental time,
Right.
phase, where they're hoping for a human augmentation, a mechanized
Yeah.
order, right? That's what they're hoping for. And even using technology to actually come to that point where they can, in some sense, the whole idea of singularity, right? The idea of understanding all in terms of like
Right.
oneness. So that's the goal. And we understand where that leads to. We understand that we've been warned about. It has happened in
Yeah.
history. We've seen the dismantling of Babel,
Well,
right?
it's happened.
And the
It's happened
spectrum.
recently. I mean, we've lived through it, and I point this out. It's a hubris, as you say. And in the 20th
Yeah,
century, we had the eugenics movement, which two nations across the globe were most famously engaged in the eugenics movement. One was the United States of America. Buck versus Bell in 1927 said that we could, sterilize forcibly all, quote, feeble-minded, unquote, people so that we could stamp out the dredges of society. That happened, that went on until the
while
19
using them as an argument that we want to
improve
improve
humanity.
the
Yeah.
condition.
And the
Exactly.
other famous nation, of course, was Nazi Germany, who used the exact same arguments in the exact same way. They just didn't
Yeah.
only go for those who they classified as feeble-minded. They also went for the Jews because they classified them similarly. So we have the eugenics movement. We have I always point to the frontal lobotomy. The man who pioneered the frontal lobotomy got a Nobel Prize in medicine. And it's a spectacular failure if you understand how it did calm some individuals, but the side effects on other individuals were hideous. And it's a very
Yeah.
clear parallel to what we're seeing in the transgender movement today. It may make some people feel better for a little while, but at a much, much greater cost than people should bear. So we've seen this even today. It's a hubris to think that we could take something new and experiment on our children with it. Oh my gosh. Are we that much of an
And
animalistic society that we're going to take something that where we don't know what 30 years from now this is going to bring and experiment on our kids? It's shocking.
yeah, yeah. But they are the innocent ones, right? That's why we are to step in and be a voice to them, to the vulnerable and those who can't speak. Um, the fundamental error in all this, Lenny, and this is where I would want to point our listeners to, is that why our Christian faith matters is that there's a rejection of our participation in Adam's action as our federal head. There's a denial of original sin, or our identification with the fall, with some political or economic arrangement. So what's happening is that we are assuming in all this that man is born blank
Yeah.
slate. He's corrupted by the system. So you have to dismantle the system and recreate it to basically redeem mankind,
Right.
right? So what happens under this arrangement is that the oppression, be it like through gender or race, becomes a pathological issue to be corrected by either deconstructing system or creating some new kind of medication of a sort that would improve us as social beings. So human problem is no more seen as sin, rather limitation.
Yeah.
That's why even in our justice system, if you commit any crime, people are arguing that don't send them to, right, life
Yeah.
imprisonment. Don't we argue against death penalty and all? Why? Because we are saying that they are corrupted by the system. There is no sin issue in
Right.
them. They're not guilty,
Right. They're not,
right?
ultimately,
So
they're not responsible for their own actions. Yes.
yeah, so we are disconnecting humanity from the first Adam. We are trying to do that so that we may not need the second Adam for our
Yeah.
redemption.
And
That's exactly what's happening.
isn't it interesting that we talk about these ideas, we talk about the idea of the one, of this Gnostic concept that you see yourself sitting above even your own body. Your body is a tool like a car. It's yours, and you can customize it as you so wish. And it doesn't matter because it's just a body, and it's not who, you are you, and your body is something else, and it may need to be changed in order to reflect the real you. But
Yeah.
why does the church not teach a strong biblical anthropology? I mean, when was the last time you heard a pastor discuss the idea that human beings are both body and soul? And as body and soul, we don't have carte blanche to do with our bodies what we choose. We don't talk about those kinds. We talk about salvation. We talk about Jesus loves us. And those are important topics. But we don't talk about the idea that, we are, as human beings, meant to be physical. And our physical aspects are as much a reflection of us as our spiritual aspects. It's not that we are a soul in a body, it's that we are an ensouled body.
And this is why, exactly, and this is why there is an aversion to institutions. Because institutions that God has instituted or ordained cater to your physical reality.
Yes.
Right? So if you're not being embodied in any sense, which even the secularists are not, they are more on the material side. Everything is material. So their focus and their hope of redemption is institutions and systems. Whereas that's not the case for us. For us, we are spiritual beings, but also physical beings. And God has ordained these institutions that he has given us, like family, the church, and the civil government, and whatever it may be. They need to be redeemed. So you're absolutely right, Lenny, that we have to bring back that kind of reverence, in one sense, for how much God gives importance to our body as much as to our soul and spirit. So in that regard, I think this is why we are talking about the household today, right? Resisting the war against household. The world understands it well, much more than the church. That as the family goes, so goes the church, and so goes the nation.
Absolutely, if you center it there. Even this concept of my authentic self, right? Be authentic is what you. One of my favorite stories was a story where Tony Campolo tells it, where he was counseling a young couple getting ready to get married, and he says, here's this young man and this young woman looking at each other with moon-eyed love and things like that, and he starts asking, well, how are you going to provide for her? How are you going to? Well, I don't want to necessarily be tied down. I need to find out who I am. I got to peel away all the layers that my family put on me and the layers that my society puts on me. I need to peel it all away and find the real self that I am. And Campolo says, well, what if you're an onion? And I go, what do you mean? He goes, what if you peel away all the layers and hey, there's nobody there, What if who you are is the sum total of all of your life experiences, of all of your quote unquote layers? And what you do is you refine yourself within those experiences, within those layers, to, again, try to make a better person of yourself. But how are you authentic if there's nothing against which to compare authenticity? What does, again, it's one of these word games. What does that mean to be authentic? I know if I'm talking about, purchasing, a piece of maybe designer clothing, it's authentic if it actually comes from the designer. Because there's fakes out there that look really, really good. They look just like the real thing.
So, in our culture, being authentic it has come down to this, that man is a sexual being. That's the primary being or nature of
That's
man.
what they
So
believe.
when that happens, you have to express yourself sexually the way you want to,
And isn't
right?
that sad how how demeaning, how low, how unimportant something that you do for a couple of days a week, maybe for half an hour a night. I mean, how is that the sum total and the essence of who you are? We used to
And
consider
this is
that
why
as
then,
base and dismissive. I mean, any
yeah,
woman who walks into the office and is judged on her, sexual potential would slap someone.
this is why, as culture, we have adopted two basic ideas, which is the attitude of
Mm-hmm.
presentism and pleasure without restraint, right? So it's about now. It's
Right.
about justice now. We need to topple down all the statues. We can argue about it later, maybe, right? But it has to come down now. Justice now. Revolution now. Not reformation, which is a process. And also pleasure without restraint. This is why biblical marriage as an institution is so much important to be
Mm.
maintained, because that's what maintains God's anthropology by holding
Yeah.
on in place human nature. Right? This is why parents have to make sure that they stick together against the atomistic idea of union,
Yeah.
right? Today, it's so easy for you to actually like go into like no fault divorce and be separated so easily. And if the kids are seeing that, if they're seeing this basic unit of authority being dismantled, they would have absolutely no hope left for them. They would
Yeah.
not know that there is a greater purpose in an ordered life. We have to set those examples
Oh, I
before them,
agree.
and that can only happen through the way of covenant that is maintained within marriage.
So let's talk about this as we get ready to wrap up. What are some good practical suggestions that you would offer the family in order to first help stem the onslaught of this messaging, which is everywhere in our society today, and then
Yeah.
ways to build up a good, strong Christian ethic, especially in our children? How do we go about changing the tide on this?
Yeah, I think before taking a posture of teaching them, we have to really check where we are as a household,
Okay.
right? Where is your marriage? It is the first line of defense against the culture of chaos. And I mentioned about the attitude of presentism and pleasure without restraint, because marriage puts constraints around both.
Yes.
You can't be presentist as a parent.
Yeah.
You can't keep pleasure as the primary thing in your marriage. Doesn't happen. Anyone who is married, ask them, doesn't happen. So maintain your marriage, make it as strong as possible. It is a bold statement against the spirit of the age. You have to understand that and begin there. Then recover a true sense of reality. You have to do that. You have to tell your children that you intentionally entered into a world knowing that it will bring experiences of furnace and pain. They have to know that.
That's a great
Because
point.
if you're projecting to them that it's all good and pleasure and everything, that you entered into this joyfully, which you should, but without realizing the reality around you, that will be a wrong precedence
Right.
that you're going to put around them. So we live in a pain-averse culture.
Yeah.
Even in our art, we see that so much. So we have created a world with soft edges. Somehow we have to help them become more anti-fragile, because world wants to create them more fragile. The task of the family is to actually create them more anti-fragile. That's what I would
Yeah.
say. And avoid enabling selfism. Create for them places where their commitment to self is not promoted over above their commitment towards others. So take them out to places, take them out to churches, food banks, or wherever that might be, that they are not focused merely on themselves, right? Or inward commitment to the self, but outward commitment to others. Show them the united front. Your children have to see that you, as parents, we understand that there might be times when we may not be on the same page, but understand this, that your children have to see that you're at least in the same book,
Yeah. There you go.
if not on the same page.
Okay.
You got to show them the united front. Then teach them to love God's standard. Many a times what happens with kids is that they associate their faith with their father's anger or mother's, anger. So avoid that. Teach them to admire the standard. And you can do that only if you are yourself you know, loving the standard.
Right.
I remember D.A. Carson, he said the worst possible heritage to leave with children would be high spiritual pretensions and low performance.
Ah,
And we can't do
that's
that,
great.
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We got to, yeah, and I'll also say, and I touched on this a while ago, that we got to reclaim the abdicated authority. You are not merely caretakers. You've been given the responsibility to craft the early chapters of the eternal souls.
Yeah.
Think about that, right? Early chapters of eternal souls. God entrusted that to you, and you have a greater responsibility. Establish righteous gatekeeping. Check who's teaching your kids. Check about the youth pastors or whoever, right? Even your pastors or core group members or leaders. If you're sending them to camps, find out what is it that they are teaching. All because something has a label Christian doesn't mean that they're teaching things
That's right.
biblically.
That's right.
Right? And I would say, be prepared to suffer. You will suffer as parents in this culture in which we are living. And for that, what you need is a good support system around you. Build that community. Come alongside people, community. Yeah, you're like-minded. I remember in my own life, though we don't have our own children yet, but I understand the need of community for children around us, like-minded people. Because what's happening right now is that a lot of our kids, they have a certain kind of culture in which they are raised at home. But when they step out, they don't find the similar kind of,
Right.
culture that their parents and their pastors are promoting. So we have to have an outlet where they see that it's not just my parents. It's not just people who are in my church who believe in that. So you have to have a community that goes even beyond your church, limits, not just your church members.
And teaching them
outside.
and teaching them community again, it gets the focus off of themselves. Absolutely.
Exactly. And finally, I would say that we live in a very gelatinous kind of world, right? With a lot of fragility around it. What we need is to recover holy dogmatism. Chesterton said that dogma does not mean the absence of thought, but the end of thought. That's what we need to teach our children. We need to be teaching them who God is and who he has created us to be. And in so doing, and praying for them, standing and fighting for them, right? And I would say this, see it more like Moses, encountering God in the burning bush. He's meeting God, after 40 years of wilderness. And the first thing God is asking him to do is to remove his shoes.
Right.
Strange thing, isn't it? But he's there God is appointing him and ordaining him to lead a people to a destination that he has for them. And the first thing he's asking is to let his feet be submitted to God, that he may make it beautiful, that he may actually proclaim the good news of the gospel, right?
Absolutely.
In Isaiah, as we read. And that's what parents are. Let's give our feet to God. And scripture doesn't say that blessed, is the mouth or the mind. It says blessed are the feet. That's the first thing. Let God give you the direction of leading your family to a place where he wants you to be. And in so doing, and in our prayers, I'm sure and I'm confident God will honor us if we are faithful to him.
Okay.
He is a father, he understands.
Well, yeah, I think that's a great place to kind of wrap up our conversation. This has been a lot of fun. I definitely will come back and talk about some of these other issues in upcoming podcasts. What's interesting is that on Fridays when we do the radio show, we'll normally meet at a little restaurant and we'll just have 40 or 50 minutes of conversation, and we'll have conversations like this where we'll just talk to one another, and it's almost like you want to record those sometimes in all of this. But I think it's great. I think this is really important. I think there's going to be a lot of people who are worried about their kids. Definitely, I know that's true. But what's the solution? How do I go about it? How do I even understand what's going on? Hopefully, some of what we've said here will advance that, help them make sense, at least a little bit, of what we're seeing in our society. And with prayer and deliberateness, we'd be able to overcome these kinds of things. So, okay, so Jacob, your folks can follow you at Heritage Council, and I'll put the link of your website down in description below. Thank you so much, my friend. Always good to talk with you.
It's been my joy, Lenny. I really
All
loved
right,
it. Thank
we'll
you.
talk soon. So that wraps up this edition of Come Let Us Reason Together. I hope that you've enjoyed this discussion. Any comments, questions, leave them below. We'd love to hear from you. And until next time, this is Lenny Esposito saying so long. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.